Thanks EnergyBox for organizing this nice event. This is my first participation, and I hope it's not the last one. This topic has gained particular importance since the blackout of Spain last week. I'm from Spain, so I was living in the dark ages for a few hours, and I don't recommend it to anyone. Anyone suffered it apart from me? No one here? You're lucky. So it's a grid-forming technology applied to energy systems, not only to renewable energies. We're going to be focusing on 3 points related to grid-forming technology. First, what are the market trends in this sector? And then we're looking at the technological advantages and some reference cases. So let's start with the trends in the market. As many of you already know, we are living a transition in power systems in which the share of renewable energy sources into the generation mix is growing very rapidly. And this is driven mainly by global warming standards that, in turn, are reflecting on the decommissioning of traditional power plants such as nuclear or gas. So because we're adding more renewable energies, which are mainly PV and solar and wind, traditional converters, they are based on power electronics. So it means that we are introducing a lot of power electronics into the grid, which by nature, they lack the capability of providing system inertia. Unlike synchronous generators, which are big rotating and heavy machines like the ones we see in the nuclear reactors, in the gas turbines, and hydro, for example. So this lack of inertia can threaten the stability of the system, meaning that unwanted oscillations can be entered into the system, and in the worst case scenario, like in the case of Spain last week, a complete blackout. So what I'm going to introduce in this presentation, it's Hopewind capabilities of providing grid-forming support or inertia to the grid apart from other functions. Before I get to this topic, let me first start with explanation of what a grid following inverter is, which is the traditional inverters that we all have seen in the market. They are called grid following because they follow the grid, meaning that they need to have a reference of voltage and frequency from the grid in order to inject current. That's why sometimes we refer to these inverters as current source devices, which are great, but they have some limitations, as I'm highlighting here, these 6 points. First of all, limited grid resilience, because they don't have the capability of actively supporting the voltage and frequency, which is especially important during disturbances and outages. Second, potential for instability, meaning that oscillations can grow very quickly if they are not properly controlled and in time, which can affect especially in weak grid scenarios or systems with high penetration of renewable energies. Third point, limited grid support capabilities. I mean, of course, the inverters, grid-following inverters support the grid, but they have some limitations, especially in the terms of response speed, and this is because the voltage and frequency references that they get in order to inject current or power, they come from local measurements traditionally done at the PPC level. So they have some delay in responding to those commands, let's say. Inability to provide ancillary services, for example, system inertia. I mentioned that already, but I'm going to explain that in a minute. Power oscillation damping, black start, fast frequency response, and so on. Challenges with damping. So some grid codes are already including the power oscillation damping into their requirements, but they require the inverters to not contribute to the oscillations. They don't ask you to actually damp the oscillations. And last but not least, there's an increased reliance on synchronous generator because of this lack of inertia in the system, which is threatening the global warming goals, let's say. So what is a grid-forming technology or grid-forming inverter? By grid-forming, I mean that it's an inverter that can create its own grid, its own voltage and frequency. So it doesn't depend on the strength of the grid, let's say. So some of the advantages that this brings into the system is, first of all, that the inverters can operate as a virtual synchronous generator, VSG. So they emulate the behavior of a synchronous or generator rotating machine, let's say. And they do that by implementing into the algorithm what is called the swing equation, which describes the behavior of synchronous generators and let's say, their behavior in terms of power imbalances. So when the inverter integrates this equation into the algorithm, it can create a voltage vector which has a magnitude and a phase angle that is going to make it behave as a synchronous generator, let's say, in terms of inertia. So when this happens, the inverter starts working as a voltage source as opposed to a current source. So two different concepts. This brings another added benefits. The inverter now can work in off-grid conditions because it creates its own grid, let's say. So very important also for weak grid scenarios, islanded operation, and things like that. And apart from that, you see the list of enhanced capabilities that the system, grid-forming inverter can provide. System strength, fast frequency response, voltage and frequency stability, inertia, power oscillation damping, and black start. I'm going to cover those in a few minutes. So grid-forming technology. Now we dive into the details and the benefits. Here is just to mention that the grid forming capability, it's implemented at the algorithm level, so there's no additional hardware required. For example, when using a string inverter, it's the own string inverter that provides the capability, or when we're using a PCS for storage, it will be fed from the batteries. One of those capabilities, as I mentioned before, is the inertia response. So inertia is the ability to resist changes in frequency. And I'm referring to very abrupt changes in frequency. For example, those that we see here from 50 to 51.5 hertz, or from 50 to 49. So the inverter will react by either injecting or absorbing active power to very quickly, in a matter of microseconds or a few milliseconds, bring back to normal the frequency to 50 hertz. Again, this is very important in systems with high penetration of renewables, like for example Spain. If we have had this in place, I can tell you we would probably have not had the blackout, or the effects would have been much lower. Next, the grid-following inverter can actively participate in the primary frequency response. So if we look at grid-following inverters, the traditional inverters, they have in their algorithms under frequency and over frequency threshold limits that when they are surpassed, the inverter will disconnect to protect itself and to protect the grid. Grid-forming inverters not only will not disconnect, but they will help stabilize very quickly this frequency to normal values. Weak grid adaptability. So as I mentioned a few times in the presentation, these inverters are very good for weak grids, which are those with a low source-circuit ratio of 2 or less. So here we have a couple of examples in which the source-circuit ratio has been reduced from 3 to 1.5. If you look at the right-hand side, this is a grid-following inverter, traditional inverter, and you can see the response in voltage and current when the source-circuit ratio is changed. Another added benefit is here on the bottom is added support to high voltage right-through or low voltage right-through events, in the sense that the inverter will help the voltage dip to be less than it would have been with a grid-following inverter, which brings back to normal the system very, very quickly. Another one is the power quality improvement. So here I'm mentioning the harmonics and the voltage imbalance. So for example, in terms of harmonics, because the grid-forming inverter creates its own voltage, it can regulate the current, and therefore it can mitigate the effects on harmonics. And even if the harmonics happen, it will help mitigate their effect on the grid. Again, this is very important for weak grid conditions. And also voltage imbalance. For example, grids, I need to always think about it, grid-following inverters. They can create oscillations in the DC link of the inverter, which will may implement the fluctuations. On the other hand, grid-forming inverters, they can inject dynamically reactive current to balance the situation and bring back to normal the voltage phases. Voltage regulation, not going to spend time on this one because I explained what the frequency regulation is, so similar idea. The added benefit is that the inverter can work in islanded operation and even in off-grid conditions. Very stable voltage and current as opposed to this one here, which is a grid-following inverter. Online mode switching, what does it mean? It means that you don't need to select to buy a grid-following or grid-forming inverter, because everything is done at the algorithm level. There's no, as explained before, additional hardware. The important thing to keep in mind is that the inverter will automatically switch from, let's say, voltage source mode, which is a grid-forming, to current source mode, a grid-following, in a matter of microseconds or a few milliseconds. Last but not least, black start. So grid-forming inverters, they help re-energize the system after a complete blackout. And there are a couple of ways to do it. One of them is to do a simultaneous black start, meaning that all inverters will enter at the same time, which is not recommended, because remember that each inverter will generate its own voltage and frequency, so you will have synchronization issues. So what the recommendation is to do a stepwise, let's say, reconnection. So one inverter will act as a master and the other ones as slaves. So the master will ramp up to a certain value, 20, 30%, and then later on the other inverters will ramp up at the same level. I mean, there's more to this, so this is just in brief. And just to finish some applications of grid forming, because Hopewind is an expert in converters, not only for solar, also in wind, in hydrogen, in variable frequency drives, and many other things in hydrogen. So we have actually certified these capabilities in the laboratory with DMV. We are the first converter to achieve this certification, which was done with a hardware-in-the-loop test bench, let's say. And just to finish, 2-3 examples, just to demonstrate you that we can provide grid forming for any type of inverter. So this is a storage container. So we provide the grid forming capabilities to the PCSs in the station. For wind, we have many examples of wind converters that have this capability. In this case, we have 32 converters in 3 megawatt turbines. And just to finish, this is something we're very proud about. This is the first PV project in the world, which is large scale, in which it has been deployed, this functionality. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Alvaro, for that insightful presentation. Thank you.